On the night of December 25th, 1776, the American Revolution was close to collapse. George Washington's army had been driven out of New York, chased across New Jersey, and pushed all the way to the western bank of the Delaware River. Behind him was Pennsylvania. In front of him was an army that believed the rebellion was dying. The British had taken New York. They had captured Fort Washington. They had forced the Americans into retreat after retreat. And now winter had arrived. Washington's soldiers were exhausted, hungry, badly clothed, and in many cases barefoot. Some had no shoes at all. Many had enlistments that would expire at the end of the year. If enough men went home, there might not be a Continental Army left. The British command believed the American cause was nearly finished. But Washington had one last gamble. He would cross the Delaware on Christmas night, march through a freezing storm, and attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton. If he failed, the army might disappear. If he succeeded, he might save the revolution. And what happened next would change the war in New Jersey forever. To understand why Washington was willing to take such a desperate risk, you have to understand the disaster that had come before it. In the summer of 1776, the American Revolution still looked like it might succeed. The Declaration of Independence had been signed only months earlier. Thousands of men had joined Washington's army. But the British response was enormous. General William Howe had assembled one of the largest expeditionary forces Britain had ever sent overseas. The Americans met it around New York, and then everything began to fall apart. The Battle of Long Island was a disaster. The Americans were forced to retreat. New York City fell. Washington pulled his army north, then south, then across New Jersey. Everywhere he went, the British followed. By November, the British had captured Fort Washington. Fort Lee was abandoned. The American retreat became a race toward the Delaware. Washington's army was no longer one solid force. Units were scattered. Militia disappeared into the countryside. Soldiers deserted. Supplies were running out, and the British were capturing one New Jersey town after another. The British commander, General Charles Cornwallis, pushed hard across the state. But there was a problem. Winter was coming. The British Army had won so much territory that its forces were now spread across a chain of isolated garrisons. One of those garrisons was at Trenton, and that was where Washington saw his chance. Trenton was held by roughly 1,400 Hessian soldiers commanded by Colonel Johann Rall. The Hessians were German troops serving alongside the British. They were experienced soldiers. They were disciplined, and they had already fought the Americans successfully. But they were also tired. They had been sent into winter quarters at Trenton. The town was not a massive fortress. There were no enormous walls, no deep defensive ditch, no permanent fortifications. The Hessians believed the Americans were too beaten to attack. Washington wanted them to keep believing that. His plan was simple in theory. Cross the Delaware, attack Trenton at dawn, destroy the garrison, capture its supplies, then get back across the river before the British could react. But the Delaware was not cooperating. The river was filled with floating ice. The temperature was below freezing. Snow and sleet were beginning to fall, and Washington still had to move thousands of men, horses, artillery pieces, and equipment across the water. The man responsible for getting much of the army across was Colonel John Glover. Glover's regiment came largely from Marblehead, Massachusetts. They were fishermen and sailors. They knew how to handle boats, and on that night, their skills became as important as their rifles. The crossing began. Men crowded into large Durham boats. Ice slammed against the hulls. The wind cut through their clothing. The river was dark. The storm made everything harder, and the timetable began slipping. Two other American forces were supposed to cross the river at different points and attack other Hessian positions. They could not complete their crossings. The ice and weather stopped them. Washington's larger plan was falling apart. But he continued. Around 2,400 men made the crossing with him. The artillery came too. 18 guns. The army reached the New Jersey side in the early morning hours, and there was still a long march ahead. Trenton was roughly 9 miles away. The men were already exhausted. Now they had to march through the freezing darkness. There was no guarantee the surprise would survive until dawn. There was no guarantee the Hessians would remain unaware. And there was no guarantee Washington's men would even reach Trenton together. But they marched. The road froze beneath their feet. The snow covered the countryside. The men moved silently through the darkness. Some of them left bloody footprints behind, because their feet had been cut by ice and frozen ground. The army was exhausted, but it was moving toward the enemy instead of away from him. That difference mattered. Inside Trenton, the Hessians had spent Christmas night celebrating. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, had received warnings that the Americans might attack. But he did not believe Washington could organize a serious assault. The Continental Army had been retreating for weeks. The Delaware was behind them. Winter was in front of them. And the Americans appeared finished. Rall was wrong. At approximately 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26th, the first shots were fired. The Hessian outposts suddenly found themselves facing American soldiers. Then more appeared, and more. Washington's army was entering Trenton from multiple directions. General Nathaniel Greene's column approached from the north. General John Sullivan's men moved in from another direction. And behind them came Henry Knox's artillery. The surprise was almost complete. The Hessians scrambled to assemble. Rall tried to organize his regiments. Men ran through the streets. Officers shouted orders. The artillery crews attempted to bring their guns into action. But the Americans were already inside the town. Washington had one immediate objective: the Hessian artillery. If the Americans captured the guns, the garrison's ability to organize a counterattack would collapse. Knox's artillery opened fire. American infantry pushed forward. The Hessians attempted to form a line, but they were being attacked before they could properly organize. The fighting moved through the streets of Trenton. Rawle tried to rally his men personally. He mounted his horse and rode toward the fighting. Then he was wounded. The Hessian defense began to break apart. Some men attempted to escape. Others tried to reach the open countryside. But the American forces were closing around them. Within roughly an hour and a half, the fighting was over. The Hessians surrendered. Nearly 1,000 prisoners were taken. Their artillery was captured. Their supplies were captured. The Americans had suffered only a handful of killed and wounded. But the most important thing Washington captured that morning was not a cannon. It was confidence. For months, the Continental Army had been running. At Trenton, it had attacked, and won. The news spread through the American colonies. The army that everyone thought was finished had just destroyed a professional enemy garrison. But Washington understood something the celebrations could not hide. The British would respond, and they would respond with overwhelming force. The victory at Trenton did not end the campaign. It started the next phase. Washington withdrew across the Delaware with his prisoners. Then, days later, he crossed back into New Jersey. His army gathered around Trenton once again. This time, the situation was different. The British knew exactly where he was. And Cornwallis was coming. He gathered thousands of British troops and marched south. The force approaching Washington was vastly larger than the Hessian garrison Washington had just defeated. By January the 2nd, Cornwallis had reached Trenton with roughly 6,000 men. Washington had only a fraction of that force. And now the Americans were trapped. The Delaware River was behind them. Cornwallis was in front of them. There was nowhere obvious to go. The British attacked. Washington's men fell back toward the Assunpink Creek. The British pressed forward. The American position became increasingly dangerous. Cornwallis believed he had finally trapped Washington. The American army could not cross the Delaware easily. The British would attack again in the morning. The war could end right there. But Washington had another idea. That night, the American commanders gathered. The question was simple: stay and fight the British army in the morning, or escape? Washington chose something more dangerous. He would leave without Cornwallis realizing it. The Americans built fires. They made enough noise to suggest that men were still working on the defenses. Then, under cover of darkness, the army began slipping away. The British sentries did not realize what was happening. Washington was not retreating toward the Delaware. He was moving around Cornwallis, toward Princeton. The army marched through the night. And while Cornwallis waited for the battle he believed would happen at Trenton, Washington's soldiers were already behind him. By morning, the British discovered the deception. Washington was gone, but the Americans were not finished. They were heading straight toward another British position, Princeton. The British had troops stationed there. Washington wanted to strike before Cornwallis could react. The march continued. The men were exhausted. Some had barely slept. But the army kept moving. Then, near Princeton, the Americans encountered British troops marching toward Trenton. The two forces collided. The Battle of Princeton began. The fighting became confused. American units were pushed back. General Hugh Mercer, one of Washington's most trusted officers, was separated from his men and surrounded. He refused to surrender. British soldiers attacked him with bayonets. Mercer was mortally wounded. The American line began to falter, and then Washington arrived. He rode forward toward the fighting. For a moment, some of his soldiers could barely see him through the smoke. Then they watched their commander ride directly toward the British fire. Washington rallied the troops. The American line steadied, and the battle turned. The British were pushed back. Princeton fell. Washington had won again, 2 victories in a matter of days. But the real achievement was larger than 2 battlefields. The British had spent months pushing the Continental Army across New Jersey. They had captured New York. They had driven Washington into Pennsylvania. They believed the American rebellion was on the verge of collapse. Then Washington crossed the Delaware. He destroyed the Hessian garrison at Trenton. He escaped Cornwallis. And he defeated another British force at Princeton. The campaign had changed completely. The British could no longer assume that Washington's army would simply run. More importantly, American soldiers began believing that they could actually win. That mattered because the army was running out of time. Many enlistments expired at the end of December. Washington needed men to stay. He needed recruits. He needed supplies. He needed the political leadership of the colonies to believe the revolution could survive. Trenton gave him something he desperately needed. Proof. Proof that British regulars and Hessian troops could be beaten. Proof that surprise could compensate for numbers. Proof that the Continental Army still had a fight left in it. The British eventually withdrew from much of New Jersey. Washington established his winter quarters at Morristown. The American army had survived the crisis. But the cost had been enormous. The campaign had begun with defeat after defeat. The Americans had lost New York. They had lost Fort Washington. They had abandoned Fort Lee. They had retreated across New Jersey. Thousands of soldiers had been lost through casualties, desertion, sickness, and expiring enlistments. And yet, the revolution survived. Not because Washington had suddenly gained a massive army. He had not. Not because the Americans had superior weapons. They did not. And not because Britain had become weak. It had not. The difference was that Washington had finally found a way to use the one advantage the British could not easily match. Surprise! At Trenton, a small American army crossed a frozen river at night and attacked a professional garrison that believed it was safe. At Princeton, that same army slipped around a much larger British force and struck again. The victories were small compared with the enormous battles that would come later, but their psychological effect was enormous. The British had expected the rebellion to collapse during the winter of 1776. Instead, Washington had turned the winter into a counterattack. New Jersey became the place where the American Revolution refused to die. Years later, historians would call the period from the Delaware crossing through Princeton the 10 crucial days. The phrase fits because the fate of the revolution really did seem to hang on those few days. Before Christmas, Washington was retreating. After Princeton, he was choosing where to fight. Before Trenton, British officers could look across New Jersey and see a defeated enemy. After Princeton, they had to hunt for him. That was the change. The battlefield at Trenton was small. The fighting lasted only about an hour and a half. The Hessian garrison was not an enormous army. But history is not always decided by the size of the battlefield. Sometimes it is decided by what happens afterward. The captured Hessian soldiers were marched away as prisoners. The American guns were pulled back toward the Delaware, and the men who had crossed the river in the freezing darkness now knew something they had not known before. They could win. The British army had not disappeared. The war was nowhere near over, but the American Revolution had survived its darkest winter. Washington had taken an army that was running out of soldiers, supplies, and hope and given it something more valuable than any single piece of equipment, a reason to keep fighting. The British had believed the rebellion was dying. Trenton proved it was not. And when Washington's soldiers crossed that frozen river on Christmas night, they were not simply marching toward a Hessian garrison. They were marching toward the possibility that the entire revolution might survive. The river was filled with ice. The weather was brutal. The army was exhausted. The enemy was waiting. But Washington crossed, and by sunrise, the army that had spent months retreating was advancing again. That was what Trenton changed. Not the size of the war, not the number of soldiers, the direction. For a few desperate days in December 1776, the American Revolution had been pushed to the edge of a frozen river. It could have ended there. Instead, Washington crossed, and New Jersey became the place where the revolution came back to life. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and let us know in the comments which forgotten battle of the American Revolution we should cover next.